We all hear stories about the dark corners of history, the things people don't want to talk about, the family secrets buried so deep the tombstones don't even whisper them. We talk about wars and kings, fortunes and failures. Almost nobody talks about the uncomfortable truths that happen behind closed doors, in isolated cabins, far from any road. A brother, a sister, and the 17 children they had together. This isn't a myth. This isn't a legend from a faraway land. This happened in 1897, in the deep woods of Alabama. You are about to hear the story of the Sullivan family. A story pulled from census records and county courthouse ledgers. The story of what happens when poverty, isolation, and silence mix into a tragedy that lasts for generations. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from United States Census records and Alabama State Archives. Now back to the story. The story begins not with a crime, but with a quiet desperation. The year is 1895. The place is a hardscrabble patch of land in rural Tallapoosa County, Alabama. The Civil War is a fresh scar, 30 years old. Reconstruction is over, but for many, the poverty that followed is a war of its own. In a small, unpainted shack lived the Sullivan family. They were dirt poor. They owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few acres of land that barely grew enough to feed them. In this world, there were two children, a brother and a sister. Thomas Sullivan, born in 1871, and Mary Sullivan, born 2 years later in 1873. They grew up together, isolated from the world. The nearest town was a day's walk. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Their world was the humid woods, the red clay soil, and the four walls of their cabin. Their parents died of fever in the winter of 1896. Thomas was 25. Mary was 23. They were alone, completely and utterly alone. What happened next wasn't a decision made in a single moment. It was a slow drift, a product of isolation so profound that the rules of the outside world ceased to exist. They knew only each other. They depended only on each other. In the spring of 1897, Mary became pregnant. The father was her brother, Thomas. Their first child, a boy named John, was born in a cold December that same year. He was the first of 17. 17 children. Say the number out loud. 17. Between 1897 and 1917, Mary Sullivan was almost constantly pregnant. A child was born nearly every year. A relentless 20-year cycle of pregnancy, birth, and hunger. Out of the 17 children born to Thomas and his sister Mary, 8 did not survive past their second birthday. 8 small, unmarked graves were dug by their own father in the woods behind the cabin. Diphtheria took 2 in 1 week. The flu took another, for were simply born too weak, too small to survive in a world with no medicine and little food. Their names are lost to history. They were just numbers in a family ledger that was never written down. The 9 who survived grew up in a world of silence and confusion. The Sullivans did not go to town. They did not go to church. Their children did not go to school. Their 2-room cabin, built by their father, became a world unto itself. As the years went on, the genetic consequences began to show. The children were frail. 2 of the boys had club feet. 1 of the girls was born with a cleft palate. 3 of the children were, in the language of the time, feeble-minded. They couldn't speak in full sentences. They moved slowly. Their eyes seemed to look past you, not at you. The 1910 census taker, a man named Arthur Finch, had to ride his horse for 6 hours to find their property. His official record is a chilling document. Under head of household, he wrote Thomas Sullivan. Under wife, he wrote Mary Sullivan. He did not ask or did not dare to write their relationship. He listed 9 children living in the home. For occupation, he wrote farmer for Thomas. For everyone else, including Mary and the oldest children, he simply wrote none. Under the column for can read and can write, he marked no for every single person in the household. 17 people, 17 souls. Not one could read or write their own name. The family survived on what they could grow and what Thomas could hunt. Cornbread and squirrel was a feast. Often it was just corn. The children were perpetually skinny, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. They wore clothes made from stitched-together flour sacks. They had no shoes. To the few hunters or loggers who stumbled upon their clearing, the Sullivan children were like ghosts. Pale, silent figures who would stare with wide, vacant eyes before melting back into the trees. They spoke in a strange pidgin dialect of their own, a mix of grunts and a few English words their parents had taught them. They were a clan unto themselves, cut off from the human race. The outside world crashed into theirs in the fall of 1918. The catalyst was not a concerned neighbor or a church pastor. It was the Spanish flu. The pandemic that killed millions around the globe did not spare the backwoods of Alabama. Came for the Sullivans. Thomas, the father, was the first to fall ill. He died within 3 days, his lungs filled with fluid. He was 47 years old. Mary, his sister and the mother of his 17 children, died 2 days later. She was 45. They were buried next to the 8 infants they had lost years before. Their 9 surviving children were now orphans. The oldest, John, was 21. The youngest, Sarah, was just a toddler, born in 1916. A timber crew working a few miles away noticed the smoke from the cabin's chimney had stopped. After 2 days, their foreman, a man named Silas Black, walked over to check. What he found was a nightmare. The bodies of Thomas and Mary were wrapped in thin blankets on their beds. The 9 children were huddled together in the other room, terrified, starving, and sick. 2 of the younger children were already burning with fever. Silas Black was not a man easily shaken, but the sight of those children, their misshapen bodies, their silent, haunted faces, stayed with him for the rest of his life. He rode to the county seat, the town of Rockford, and brought back the sheriff and the county doctor. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from United States Census records and Alabama State Archives. Now back to the story. Dr. Evan Miller was the first medical professional to ever examine the Sullivan children. His report to the county is a methodical, brutal document. He noted the physical deformities, the club feet, the cleft palate, the slightly curved spines. He noted the intellectual disabilities. Of the 9 surviving children, he estimated that only 2 had what he called normal intelligence. The others, he wrote, were imbeciles and idiots, the cruel medical terms of the era. He also confirmed what the sheriff had already suspected. He interviewed the oldest son, John, who was 21 but had the mental capacity of a 10-year-old. John, in his broken speech, explained that his father was Thomas and his mother was Mary, and that Thomas and Mary were brother and sister. The secret was out. The story became a local sensation, a scandal. The Coosa County Chronicle wrote about the Hill children, a family living in squalor and sin. People from the town drove their wagons out to the edge of the Sullivan property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the children, as if they were animals in a zoo. The children, terrified of strangers, hid in the woods. What to do with them became the county's problem. They were orphans, they were sick, and they were the products of a union that society deemed an abomination. This was 1918. The eugenics movement was gaining strength in America. It was a pseudoscience that preached the idea of improving the human race through selective breeding. Eugenicists believed that things like poverty, criminality, and feeble-mindedness were hereditary traits that should be stamped out. Families like the Sullivans were not seen as victims of poverty and isolation. They were seen as proof of bad blood, proof that some people should not be allowed to have children. The fate of the Sullivan children was decided by this new, cold science. The 2 oldest boys, John and William, were deemed capable enough to work as farmhands. They were sent to live and work on a large farm on the other side of the county, their wages managed by a court-appointed guardian. They lived out their lives as laborers, never marrying, never having children of their own. They were quiet men who kept to themselves, forever marked by their strange childhood. They both died in their early 50s. The other 7 children were declared wards of the state. They were sent away. One by one, they were committed to the Alabama Home for the Feeble-Minded, an institution later known as the Partlow State School and Hospital. It was a place for people the world wanted to forget. The records from the institution are sparse. They list the children's names, their admission dates, and a brief, one-line diagnosis. Imbecile, product of incest. Moron with physical deformities. They were given numbers. Their names were rarely used again. Life in the Partlow School was not a life. It was a warehousing. The institution was overcrowded and underfunded. The children, now growing into adults, received no education, no therapy. They performed simple, repetitive tasks, mopping floors, working in the laundry, tending the institution's gardens. They were fed, they were clothed, but they were locked away from the world. The records show that one of the Sullivan girls, Martha, died of tuberculosis in the institution's infirmary in 1925. She was 24 years old. Another brother, Samuel, died after a fight with another inmate in 1931. He was 28. The state of Alabama, like many other states at the time, enacted a compulsory sterilization law. The law allowed the state to forcibly sterilize inmates of state institutions who were deemed mentally deficient. The goal was to prevent them from ever having children and passing on their defective genes. All 5 of the Sullivan children who were sent to the Partlow School were sterilized. 2 of the girls, Alice and Sarah, were sterilized in 1935. They would have been in their late 20s and late teens. The boys were sterilized shortly after. The family line of Thomas and Mary Sullivan was to be a dead end. A genetic mistake, corrected by the surgeon's knife. Of the 17 children born in that cabin in the woods, the fate of the last few is the hardest to trace. Census and institutional records show that the last of the institutionalized Sullivan children, a woman named Sarah, died at Partlow in 1987. She was 71 years old. She had spent 69 of those years locked inside its walls. She had entered as a toddler and left in a coffin. She had never known a day of freedom. She had never known a world beyond the institution's fences. Her file, now stored in the state archives, contains a single faded photograph. It was taken on her admission day in 1919, a small, scared-looking girl with big, dark eyes, staring into the camera, staring into a future that had already been stolen from her. The Sullivan land was sold by the county to pay for the children's institutional care. The cabin was torn down in the 1920s by the new owner, a timber company. They cleared the trees and planted rows of pine. Today, if you were to go to that spot in Tallapoosa County, you would find nothing. No trace of the cabin. No sign of the lives that were lived there. Even the unmarked graves of the 8 infants and of Thomas and Mary have been lost, swallowed by the forest, erased by time. It's a story with no heroes, only victims. Victims of poverty, victims of isolation, and victims of a society that, when it finally found them, chose not to help them, but to judge them, to study them, and ultimately to erase them. The scientific fervor of the eugenics movement has faded, discredited, and condemned as a brutal pseudoscience. Institutions like Partlow have been closed down, their horrifying conditions exposed. But the thinking that created them still lingers. The fear of the other. The belief that some people are less worthy, less human than others. In the 1940s, a sociologist from the University of Alabama was studying rural poverty. He came across the Sullivan case in the county records. He was granted permission to visit the surviving children at the Partlow School. He interviewed them, though their communication was limited. In his published paper, he never used their real names. He referred to them only as the L family. He wrote about their physical traits, their mental scores, their family history, all in the detached language of academic study. He described the youngest, Sarah, as placid and generally unresponsive, but capable of showing affection. He noted that when he was leaving, she held onto his hand and started to cry. He had to gently pull his hand away. He wrote it down as an observation, a data point, The file on the Sullivan family in the Alabama State Archives is thin. A few census pages, a doctor's report, a court order, and the admission forms for the Partlow School. The last entry in the entire file is a death certificate for Sarah Sullivan, dated October 12, 1987. The cause of death is listed as pneumonia. Under the line for next of kin, the space is blank. The record closes. The bloodline ends. The last name is gone.